So my organisation is the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change. We have over 70 members, including institutional investors from Korea, including NPS. And they have joined a network of investors in Asia that are managing the risks and opportunities of climate change, some of whom who are engaging with policymakers and business decision makers around the region. This is my second trip back to Korea this year. Very happy to be back here again. One of the first things I noticed when I came to Korea was the number of electric vehicles, particularly by Korean companies on the roads. And there's certainly a buzz in Australia, where I'm based, around EVs, but Korean EVs in particular, voted the best in the world. But unfortunately, the waiting list is very long in Australia to get EVs because the policies in Australia are in catch-up. We haven't had good climate policy for a long time until the new government has come in. But electric vehicle sales in Australia have gone from 2% last year to 8% this year, so moving very rapidly as our policies have evolved. I'm very aware of the dominance of Korean companies in global markets, particularly being the second largest makers of batteries for electric vehicles. So I need to congratulate what the industry has done to be a leader globally. And global investors know that Korea has a tradition and track record of building world-leading companies. Korean businesses are committing to clean energy projects, and already your businesses are growing the capital expenditure towards sustainable transport, clean energy, and green manufacturing. And this demonstrates to investors how you are planning for decarbonisation and the transition, and this is what investors need to see. This country has a very strong history in innovation and technology, and we really want to harness that opportunity now to utilise that and focus on retaining and utilising that decarbonisation locally and how to turn that into green growth and looking at changing the energy systems and processes in this market and not just export the decarbonisation to other markets. So to start off our session, I'm really pleased to introduce Ali Izadi Najafabadi, I hope I said that correctly or nearly correctly, who is the APAC Managing Director for Bloomberg New Energy Finance, to give us some context on the transition and Korea's place in that. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to share with you analysis my colleagues around the world do on energy transition. I think you've already heard a lot of discussions today. I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible. What I'm going to try to do is walk you through where we are with energy transition here in Korea as well as globally. What are some of the opportunities that we have ahead, and what are the challenges, particularly for Korea? Last year, unfortunately, was very challenging for energy transition as a result of supply chain disruptions, the return of war to Europe, and rising inflations. For most energy transition technologies, we actually saw prices increase. Offshore wind was one exception. The only reason for that is the numbers were skewed by the intense competition in China, which continues to show prices declining. We also saw a little bit of a stalling of momentum for ambitious net zero goals. Between 2020 and 2022, beginning of 2022, we saw a rapid rise by governments committing to reach carbon neutrality or net zero by mid-century. You can see that the numbers on that bar chart didn't really change much over the last year. We also saw a little bit of a recovery in coal generation. It wasn't as big as some have made it sound to be, but overall, it's certainly true that we saw a little bit of recovery in reliance on coal power. And of course, some of the policies that were announced, like the US Inflation Reduction Act and EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, did cause some concerns that we are starting to see a conflation between policies for climate change mitigation as well as geopolitics. Despite all the challenges that I listed, we saw over 30% increase in investment in the physical assets around energy transition. And last year was the first year that we saw investment exceed $1 trillion US. You can see that the largest share is still investment in renewable assets. This is your solar and wind farms. But as we just heard from Rebecca about electric vehicles, you can see that the green part of this bar also shown significant growth. So the electric vehicle segment was actually the fastest growing segment last year. Since 2017, when it comes to additional power generation capacity, the combination of solar and wind has been more than 50% of overall addition. And you can see, despite all the challenges that we've had through the pandemic, globally, that number has continued to grow. There are already over a dozen countries where they're getting over a third of their electricity from combination of solar and wind alone. I'm not even including other renewables such as hydro, geothermal, and biomass. And some of these are countries that you would be surprised. So for example, Japan is already getting about, today already getting about 10% of its electricity on a generation basis from solar alone. Over the last decade, the continued investment in scaling up manufacturing of renewable technologies and their deployment has had a profound impact on the cost of these technologies. Yes, we have hit some hiccups, particularly for wind turbines and energy storage, but those hiccups appear to be quite short-lived, and we continue to expect to go back to declining cost trends over the long term. Today, if you look at building a new power plant, and you try to calculate the levelized cost of electricity generation, what is LCOE? LCOE basically means that if you're looking at it from the perspective of the investor, looking at hitting your equity IRR, and looking at all the technologies available to you, renewables remain the most competitive technology, and that has been true since 2017 globally. Now, already in 80% of the world, the cheapest source of new electricity generation is a renewable. And more importantly, over half of the world now, solar and wind new capacity has a lower generation cost than running of existing thermal power plants. This means if you have a wholesale power market running on pure economics, then adding solar and wind starts eating into the generation share of thermal power plants. Unfortunately, many of you would have noticed on this map, it might be a little bit hard to see that the coloring for Korea is different. In the case of Korea, unfortunately, while we have seen renewable LCOE costs come down, still coal and sometimes, depending on LNG prices, gas remains cheaper. Now, a lot of this has got to do with market structure. One of those is lack of scale. We just heard from Professor Kim Sang-yup at the panel before. Professor Kim Sang-yup was the architect of the green growth strategy under President Lee Min-bak. And during that period was when Korea started providing incentives for renewables. The subsequent government sort of didn't push renewable as much, but during the previous government under President Moon Jae-in, we saw renewables grow quite substantially, particularly for solar. So solar went from a capacity around 4 gigawatt to 24 gigawatt. As you can see on this chart though, those capacity additions appear to have sort of stalled. And as a share of generation, still Korea gets a limited amount from renewables. Last year, it was less than 8%. If you combine that with nuclear, Korea is getting only about less than 40% of its electricity from zero-emission sources. Now, this is not to say that there is not interest in getting clean power. We have seen more and more Korean companies sign on to RE100. We've also seen more and more companies across the world sign into RE100 and then put pressure on their Korean suppliers. But as you can see on the chart on the right, that shows you clean power purchase agreements, and most of you were wondering, there is a Korea legend there, but you can't really read the numbers on the chart. Today, if it comes to clean power procurement in the form of clean power PPAs, it's very difficult to do them in Korea. One of the reasons for that is they're very expensive. So if you're a corporate that wants to buy clean power, right now your cheapest option is the green tariff that KEPCO offers you, but there are some problems with that green tariff, which hopefully we can get into in the panel discussion. Now, the other worrying sign is that when it comes to renewable energy investment in Korea, we're actually seeing declining amounts. You can see for the first half of this year, the numbers were significantly lower than the same period last year and all the other periods the last couple of years. Why is that? Well, unfortunately, we're starting to sense that investors, particularly international investors, are concerned that the new government is deprioritizing renewables while it focuses on nuclear. And the new measures that Moti introduced in July, particularly around having developers have a bit more financial stake, increasing the equity investment that they need to have in their own projects, as well as the commissioning timelines. While these are all good measures, they're actually starting to negatively impact the developers' ability to raise financing and proceed with projects. So overall, not a good investment environment for renewables in Korea today. This is not to say that Korean companies are not interested in climate change. We continue to see more and more Korean companies sign on to the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD. There is more interest in signing on to UNPRI. But also we are seeing Korean companies sign on to the science-based target initiatives where they have to come up with tangible transition plans compliant with Paris Agreement goal. So there's more momentum, but still the policy environment is quite challenging. Now, I criticize a lot, you may say. The one thing that we should also point out is Korea is still one of the few jurisdictions in Asia Pacific that has an emission trading scheme. That's really good. Korea is one of the only ones that still has a compliance carbon market in the region. The challenge with it is despite all the reforms that have been done, which have improved liquidity, as you notice on this price chart, the Korea EUA prices have been nosediving. The reason for that is, unfortunately, compliance demand is not going up. Why? We're still giving 90% of allocations for free. If you give them for free, obviously, you're not going to have a much impact on prices. The other challenge is that some of the reforms actually may increase the supply as Korean corporations are now being allowed to actually convert overseas offset credits if they are eligible to meet with their obligations under the KETS. Now, despite this challenge, we should remember Korea has a pretty ambitious 2030 emission reduction target, and of course it has a legislated net zero by 2050 goal. The challenge, of course, is how are we going to realize this goal? I want to cut the presentation short because we're running out of time. Apologies if I had prepared too much. I'm going to skip some of these slides, and I'm just going to come to the most important part. If you have questions about it, we can discuss it during the panel. And this is this chart. This shows you Korea's emissions by share of company. Hanjan, Korea Electric Power Company alone, is a quarter of Korea's emission. After that is POSCO. And then you've got Hyundai still there. If you look at the top 10 corporate emitters in Korea, that's more than 50% of Korea's emissions. And also, when it comes to KEPCO, that also impacts emissions from other companies, of course, because KEPCO's scope 1 and 2 emissions will be scope 2 or 3, depending on the other corporate. Now, the challenge with trying to decarbonize KEPCO is while unfortunately, the clicker appears not to be working anymore. If you could go to the next slide, please. If not, maybe I can conclude right here, actually, if we don't have time. So the main thing I want to make about this slide is, I don't think this is news to this audience. You all read the headlines last year and this year. KEPCO lost over $20 billion last year. Now, why is that? Some would blame the company, but fundamentally the challenge is that if you have an energy market where energy is not valued by economics, the company has a lot of difficulty in managing the transition. Now, the reason KEPCO had $20 billion last year was primarily because LNG and coal prices went up a lot. The previous government and the new government didn't allow them to fully reflect the rising generation cost in electricity retail prices, which resulted in high losses. Today, and that was the last chart I was going to show you, I just pulled out the enterprise value of KEPCO last night. KEPCO's enterprise value today, 95% of it is debt. If you have a company that's carrying this much debt, not having ability to increase funding through economic matters, and then it's the only company that, by the way, is charged to transition the power sector in Korea, then you have significant problems. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Ali. And I'm always very excited seeing the Bloomberg New Energy Finance presentations, and very hopeful because it really demonstrates that the economics are on our side around the climate transition. So now we really need to utilise that to accelerate the transition. So it really provides a lot of hope about the opportunity that's before us, and that the huge opportunity that's there. So we're going to move on to the panel part of our session. And I just wanted to provide a little bit of context around some of the work investors have been doing and how they are responding to some of the global policy settings we've heard about. Investors are really encouraged by some of the massive policy packages that have been signed into law in the US and Europe, for example. Obviously in US, the IRA package, which we've heard about today already, has attracted $213 billion of new investment already in clean energy, green transport, manufacturing, and it's created 170,000 jobs for people in America. Tens of thousands of these are coming from Korean companies because of their JVs with companies in the US to help decarbonise, the US, and 1.3 million jobs that are going to come from that by 2030. The European Green Deal has enabled the decoupling of greenhouse gas emissions. The GDP has grown by $2 trillion since 2009, where greenhouse gas emissions have fallen by 15%. But in closer to home, in the Asia context, last month over 1,500 investors went to Tokyo for the Principles for Responsible Investment Conference and heard Japanese Prime Minister Kishida explain his ambitious climate transformation package that investors engaged very actively on during the week there. We've got Singapore's carbon tax, which is a mechanism to direct some capital flows into clean energy and other climate solutions. And as we just heard, it's about really, tweaking these, the Korean ETS and really taking it to the next level so that it can be an effective mechanism. There have been really good policies in place in Korea for a long time to set that direction, but now it's about ratcheting it up to that next level that is required. So these net zero policies are attracting global capital markets. And investors need to see these long-term signals, but they also need to be matched with the net zero pathways that are required. And investors have the capital to support this transition. The government and sovereign balance sheets cannot do this. And so, there is the opportunity to use the private capital globally, the trillions of dollars that is available and looking for investments and looking for returns. And with the right policy environment, investors will participate. And we're seeing this move we're seeing investment flows very quickly, come through very quickly when the policy settings are in place. So this all sounds very positive. There's a lot of capital out there, but we know the science is catching up. And we know the costs of doing too little too late is harming us. I just wanted to give you a little example. We talk about 1.5 degrees. And that's what we're aiming to keep global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. So let me tell you what 1.5 degrees looks like in Australia, because that's where we've already hit 1.5 degrees of warming in Australia. I think you're all very familiar with the Black Summer bushfires of 2019-2020. The people in the cities were hiding in their homes to escape the toxic smoke. And the smoke was so toxic, we now understand, because the top layer of soil vaporized heavy metals into the smoke. This has never happened before. And we've seen all throughout 2023 and 2022 and each year before that all these things have never happened before. So that has to act as an accelerant and force us to act, because the costs of these devastating cataclysmic events are far too great for governments to clean up after. And these costs are only increasing. So there is a very blunt saying, there are no economies and no jobs on a dead planet. And we're seeing that play out. So we have to keep that in mind, and investors are keeping that in mind and understand that and are seeing some of the impacts to their portfolios as they run the temperature scenarios through their portfolios. Every tenth of a degree of warming matters, and so we need to act much more quickly to accelerate what we're doing. And we're very pleased to be coming into this market and being more active in the Korean market to help accelerate the conversations of investors, with international investors, companies, and policymakers, because this is a joint effort, and nobody can do this alone. So with that, I'd really like to introduce our panel speakers for today. So we have Jae-ha Hwang, who is the Senior Manager at the Financial Supervisory Service. We have Dong-sub Yi, Head of Global Responsible Investment and Governance Division of the National Pension Service. We have Sunghyun Hong, Head of Carbon Solution Department, the Korea Investment and Securities Company. We have Tina Chang, Associate Director, Sustainable Investing, Fidelity Investment, down the end there, an AIGCC member. And we also have Seiji Kawazoe, Global Initiatives Fellow from Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Asset Management, Japan. And I'd like to thank Seiji for joining on short notice. Unfortunately, the representative from BlackRock was not able to join us in the end today.
그 자금이 굉장히 오랫동안 지속될 수 있는 장기 투자자이기 때문에 그 장점을 충분히 살려서 1년, 2년이 아니라 3년 그 이후로도 지속적으로 인게이지해서 기업들이 잘 변화될 수 있도록 리드할 건 리드하고 지적할 건 지적하고 그다음에 제안할 건 제안하는 그런 형식으로 기업들하고 그 협력적 관계를 유지하면서 기업들을 그런 기후 변화와 관련돼서 어떻게 잘 적응하고 발전될 수 있는지 그런 부분을 좀 따져보겠다는 것이고요. 그 두 번째로는 그 국민연금이 국내 기업을 좀 한정해서 말씀드리면 한 1000여 개 기업, 저희가 이제 상장사뿐만 아니라 비상장사까지도 국내 주식이랑 채권 투자하고 있는 한 1000여 개 기업들 대상으로 ESG 저희 자체 모형을 가지고 평가를 합니다. 그 평가를 하는데 거기에 이제 대략 지표가 한 61개 정도 되는데 그 환경사회 지배구조 관점에서 측정을 하는데 그 안에도 그 환경 관련한 내용들을 이제 충분히 좀 집어넣어서 그 기업들 입장에서 현재 어느 정도 상황인지 저희가 좀 명확히 파악을 좀 하려고 노력을 하고 있고요. 다만 이제 이 자리를 빌어서 좀 말씀드리고 싶은 것은 환경 관련한 자료가 기업들이 많이 좀 공개해야 저희들 모형에도 많이 넣고 그게 더 정교화될 텐데 기업들 입장에서는 여러 가지 제한 사항을 많이 이야기합니다. 좀 준비가 좀 덜 됐다는 측면도 좀 있고 그다음에 개량하기 어렵다는 그런 말씀도 많이 하시면서 그 정보 공개율이 저희들이 측정하는 한 1000여 개 기업들 중에서 환경 쪽은 한 40% 정도밖에는 데이터가 공개가 안 돼 있는 수준입니다. 그 상대적으로 거버넌스 쪽에서는 거의 98~8%까지 데이터가 다 공개돼 있어가지고 저희가 측정하고 이러는데 문제가 사실상 거의 없는데 환경 쪽은 40% 초반이어서 저희들 입장에서는 기업들이 조금 더 공개를 좀 많이 해준다면 저희들이 그걸 가지고 평가를 해서 조금 더 정확하고 이렇게 좀 의미 있는 그런 자료들로 기업들하고 좀 대화를 할 수 있지 않을까 이런 생각도 좀 해보긴 합니다. 물론 그렇다고 저희가 포트폴리오 관점에서 아무것도 안 하는 건 아니고요. 저희들은 그 에셋 오너인데 저희를 흔히들 그 유니버셜 오너라고 부릅니다. 그게 뭐냐면 국민연금은 국내 주식, 해외 주식, 국내 채권, 해외 채권, 그다음에 얼터너티브스까지 사실상 전 세계 모든 자산을 다 소유하고 있습니다. 그래서 저희가 특별히 어떤 자산에만 투자하거나 특별히 어떤 자산에만 투자 안 하는 것이 아니고 저희가 사실상 모든 자산을 다 가지고 있기 때문에 그 밸런스가 조금씩 이렇게 이렇게 조정할 수는 있지만 저희가 어딜 특별히 배제한다거나 한쪽에만 투자하는 그런 그 투자 패턴을 갖고 있는 회사가 아니어서 저희가 그런 쪽에도 분명히 신경을 쓰고 있다는 것이고요. 또 한 가지 이제 그 책임 투자 관련해서 많이들 이야기하시는 게 투자 배제 이런 얘기도 많이 하시는데 그 특히 뭐 이제 석탄 관련해서는 국민연금이 21년도에 탈석탄 선언을 하면서 투자 제한 배제 전략을 실행하겠다고 이제 선언한 바가 있고요. 그래서 21년도에 그 신규 프로젝트 투자로 진행되는 석탄 발전이나 석탄 채굴업은 21년도부터 당장 중단을 했고요. 신규로는. 그리고 이제 그 이후에 이미 기보유하고 있는 자산에 대해서는 어떻게 할 건지에 대한 논의들이 상당히 많이 있는데 이게 아까 모두에도 나왔지만 최근에 그 뭐 러시아 우크라이나 전쟁뿐만 아니라 뭐 중동 사태 등등등으로 인해서 에너지 가격도 많이 오르고 그다음에 국내 산업의 특성 아까 우리 규제 당국에서 말씀하셨지만 국내는 2차 산업, 3차 산업 등등등 굉장히 고르게 발달돼 있고 거기에 에너지가 아주 중요한 역할을 하는데 그 석탄 화력 발전으로 발전 용량도 많이 가지고 있는 우리나라 입장에서 그 관련된 기업들을 이제 갑작스럽게 투자 제한하거나 배제하게 될 경우에 산업에 미치는 영향도 고려하지 않을 수가 없는 그런 상황인 것이죠. 그래서 저희가 이해관계자라고 계속 논의하면서 어떻게 전략을 수립할지 논의하고 있는데 그런 과정에서 이와 같은 요소들을 좀 한꺼번에 고려해야 한다라는 의견들이 있어가지고 굉장히 정교하게 그 전략을 짜기 위해서 노력 중이다라는 말씀을 좀 드리고 싶습니다. 그리고 아직은 조금 부족하긴 한데요. 저희가 아주 기본적인 수준에서 저희 포트폴리오가 배출하는 금융 배출량을 이제 측정해 보려고 하는 시도들을 저희가 내부적으로 조금씩 하고 있습니다. 아직 뭐 공개할 수준은 되지 않는데요. 그런 노력들도 여전히 구체적인 흐름에 맞추어서 하고 있으니까 뭐 조금 저희들이 좀 드러나지 않더라도 좀 잘 지켜봐 주시면 저희가 그런 백서나 이런 걸 통해서 또는 이런 자리를 통해서 지속적으로 커뮤니케이션 하도록 하겠습니다. 이상입니다.
감사합니다. Thank you. That's really great to hear. Yeah. It's very encouraging to hear the work that you've been doing, and I understand the baselining activity is quite onerous and requires a lot of resource, and I know that there are other investors from around the world who are willing to share their own experiences in doing that. So we're happy to provide that opportunity. And certainly we'll talk a bit more about engagement shortly, but great to see that you've added climate change to your engagement strategy. I hope other local investors also follow that lead. Really important signals to the markets that you're doing that. So I'd like to go to Sung-hyun from KIS. And just from your perspective, how are you approaching this work, decarbonisation, and how are you, so we'd be keen to hear from you on that front. Thank you.
안녕하십니까. 저는 한국투자증권 카본 솔루션부의 홍승현이라고 합니다. 먼저 저희는 이 자리에 나와 계신 국민연금이나 미츠 스미토모 신탁운용 같은 에셋 오너는 아니고요. 저희는 주로 자본시장에서 시장 조성이나 금융 주선을 주로 하는 일종의 중개자의 비즈니스 모델을 가지고 있는 증권사입니다. 그래서 이런 증권사로서 저희는 기후 위기에 대응하는 방법이 조금 다를 수가 있는데요. 저희는 2021년도에 카본 솔루션부를 설립을 해서 주로 그린 파이낸스나 배출권 관련된 비즈니스를 전개하기 위해서 부서를 설립을 했고요. 그게 부서의 업무는 두 가지가 있습니다. 첫 번째는 이제 국내 배출권 거래 시장에서 시장 조성자 역할을 하고 있는 부분인데요. 국내 배출권 거래 제도는 2015년에 시작이 돼서 지금 현재 한 700여 개의 기업들이 거래를 하고 있습니다. 저희는 7개의 시장 조성자들 중에서 가장 크게 시장 조성 업무를 하고 있고 가장 적극적으로 시장 조성을 하고 있습니다. 일단 국내 배출권 거래 시장은 세계에서 3위 규모의 배출권 시장으로 성장을 했고 또 그럼에도 불구하고 아직까지 거래량이나 성숙도 측면에서 많이 높지 않은 상황입니다. 하지만 2026년 배출권 거래 계획 4기가 시작되기 전에는 선물 시장도 개설이 예정되어 있고 또 그렇게 되면 ETF 같은 간접 투자 상품도 등장을 하게 되고 또 기관 투자자나 개인 투자자들도 유럽 시장처럼 배출권 거래를 할 수 있게 됩니다. 저희는 이런 국내 배출권 거래 시장이 점차 성숙해 가는데 지원을 하는 이 시장 조성 업무를 계속 수행을 할 예정이고요. 또 두 번째로 저희가 중점적으로 시도하고 있는 부분은 온실가스 감축 사업에 대한 개발 금융 부분입니다. 저희가 2년 전에 부서를 설립을 하고 다양한 온실가스 감축 사업들을 진행을 해왔는데요. 첫 번째로는 이제 방글라데시에서 정수 사업을 진행을 해서 123대의 정수 타워를 보급을 하는 프로젝트를 진행을 했고 또 네팔에서는 쿡스토브를 또 보급을 하는 사업도 시작을 했고 또 인도에서는 혼농 사업도 진행을 해서 이제 나무를 심어서 감축분을 흡수하는 그런 사업도 진행을 했고요. 최근에는 이제 우즈베키스탄에서 석탄 보일러를 이제 바이오매스 기반의 보일러로 전환해주는 이런 바이오 에너지 전환 사업도 시작을 했습니다. 이런 부분이 저희가 그 앞으로 기후위기에 대응을 하고 관련된 비즈니스 모델을 만들어 나가는 그런 저희 활동이라고 말씀드릴 수 있을 것 같습니다.
Thank you. I'd like to come to the international investors that we have with us here today. Firstly, starting with Seiji Kawajoe from Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Asset Management, on your approach to green finance in your organization.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and many thanks for having me today. I'd like to describe Sumitomo's approach to green finance / including climate. Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Asset Management is this investment management service provider based in Japan. The company has about $600 billion AUM, and funds mainly coming from asset owners like GPIF, and also public funds, and also the defined benefit plans for Japanese pension plan system. I just want to first of all introduce my sort of history and how we have established this sustainability platform within the firm. And I joined the company back in 1987, and fortunately I was able to survive in this industry for the last 34 years at the same company. And my sort of sustainability assignment spans over 16 years since the company became a signatory at PRI. So before that, I was the global portfolio manager and also analyst. So I had a slightly sort of a career change at that period. And one of the initial tasks that I had initiated at the company was to sort of delve into the word sustainability. And sustainability is the key word, as you know, from the United Nations various frameworks. And the UN frameworks such as the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, and also the United Nations Conventions on Biodiversity, and eventually the PRI, really stems from the UN report, Our Common Future. And that is basically the big bang of the sustainability sort of a progress that has been seen in terms of this sustainability framework. And so, as investment management service provider, we thought this would become very influential to the real business world. So what we have created to sort of having a philosophy into our business model, and to have establish the stewardship sort of capability, as well as this ESG analysis into our investment process. And that is basically the initial the reason why we have started to have commitment into green finance and sustainability. So back in 2006, so more than about 15, 16 years ago. And I think we asked the companies through the engagement activities and to align themselves with the say international global framework. For climate, it would be Paris Accord. For natural capital, for example, would be the Kunming-Montreal Accord, which was decided last year in December. And to do that, as an investment management company, we are also involved in various initiatives such as CA100 Plus. CA100 Plus is the global initiatives with with signatories comes from global investors, and there are more than 600 companies, institutions sign up with this climate-related initiatives, and covering more than 160 companies with high greenhouse gas emissions. So these are this initiative is engaging with directly in order to align themselves with the Paris Accord, with the climate governance, and also in terms of disclosure framework, employ the climate disclosure framework such as TCFD. And the AIGCC is also having a very strong sort of backing of this initiative. And so I would like to thank Rebecca for that. So these are the initiatives that we are sort of engaging as a global investment management service provider to encourage companies to adopt these climate-related issues. And one of the areas that I observed through this initiative is that the Seattle Plus is basically is an initiative to target or engage with companies with relatively large-sized companies. So 160 companies in global terms is very large companies. But however, when we look at our portfolio, we have various, say, Japanese companies or South Korean companies and other parts of the world. They're relatively mid to smaller size companies, and they need to sort of adapt this climate change. I think so. As an investment management company, the next challenge would be how to bring these companies into this the climate-related commitments, and that is really you need to have much more local collaboration and local knowledge, and also the dialogue. And I think that is where we need to do more, because to lift all those companies, including mid to small companies, towards the climate change will be really the key for the success. Meaning that people, even with the general public consensus, to bring these companies to the same boat, and not leaving companies behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Seiji. I think it's great to hear your long history in this, and Seiji has been, as you can hear, is an industry pioneer. He's on the Global Steering Committee for the Climate Action 100+, so do follow him up and talk to him afterwards. And he's also on the Asia Advisory Committee for the initiative as well. And particularly on that local investment, we really encourage local investors in Korea to get involved with the engagements that we have with KEPCO, POSCO, SK Innovation and Samsung Electronics, because we get the best results when international investors partner with local investors, because they know the local environment, they know the local companies and the policies, and figuring out how they can together work with the companies to achieve the transition. So thanks, Seiji, for outlining that. So Tina, I'm coming to you. I'm keen to hear Fidelity's position and how you approach this in your investments and your portfolio.
Thank you, Rebecca. And again, also want to thank the event organizer for inviting me. Very honored to be able to share Fidelity International's view and strategy on climate change. And perhaps I'll just make a small clarification from Fidelity International, which is a separate entity from Fidelity Investments. So before I go into the details, I'd like to take a step back to just articulate on why sustainability is important at Fidelity. And the way I see it is that it comes down to three main reasons. The first one is regulation. So Fidelity is based in UK, and as we all know, there is a lot of new regulations coming in from the EU, whether it's on corporate sustainability disclosure or on the financial institutions, on SFDR, the Sustainability Financial Disclosure Rules. So we have to be very aware of this trend, and so this is kind of a thing that you can't be, we have to always be on top of it. That's the first reason. The second is obviously from the client. There's also we have seen increasing and relentless client interest in sustainable investments. And so as an asset manager, it is our duty to provide these solutions and products to the market as well. And the third reason is actually just it makes business sense. It makes investment sense. So as an asset manager, we look at risks and opportunities. And in our view, companies that have a good governance that is able to manage upcoming E&S risks means that they are a sustainable business because they're able to manage any kinds of risks and opportunities that arise in the world. So these are the three main reasons. And just to answer your question, Rebecca, specifically on climate, our strategy or our goal on climate is underpinned by the overarching principle of wanting to cut real-world emissions. And as an asset manager, we think that there's two main strategy we can do that, or the biggest impact we have is first of all through investment, and second through engagement. So on the investment front, I don't think I need to elaborate more on the abundance of opportunities out there from this morning's sessions, for whether it's EV, energy transition, etc. And When we did a survey with our fundamental analysts 2 years ago on how they view ESG risks and opportunities, the results showed that more analysts think that there are more net zero opportunities than there are risks. So this really echoes our morning session. On the other hand, I also really agree with my fellow panelists as well that as an investor, we think of things holistically. We think of risk, but we think of opportunities, but we also think of the risk. So as an entity, we also have to manage our exposure to carbon, and especially through our investments. So as an entity, Fidelity does have an entity-wide commitment to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and our carbon footprint within our portfolio by 50%, so that's half, by 2030, and to be net zero aligned by 2050. We also have an operational entity level target to be net zero ourselves by 2030. And so how do we get there, right? We've set the target. What are the strategies to get there? The first one, again, is investments. We are actively aligning our investments to issuers that have proven to be net zero aligned or are proving to be more aligned to net zero. The second part is the engagement front. We are also being more strategic about our engagement strategy, targeting the top 70% of scope 1 and 2 emitters within our portfolios on intensive engagement on climate transition. And so what do we discuss during our engagements? This actually really depends on each of the company, because a discussion with a coal-fired power plant company is going to be different from, say, a auto OEM. But the bottom line, the minimum kind of things that we always seek to learn more about is disclosure on scope 1 and 2, and increasingly on scope 3 as well. We're also looking for disclosures on TCFD alignment, which is now incorporated into the ISSB S2 standards. We're also, more importantly, really looking for how the business strategy is aligned with net zero. And we've been conducting these engagements for quite a few years now. And so most companies have actually been really responsive and really improving year on year. However, when we do have companies that we see are making kind of insufficient progress, then we do have a voting policy in place since 2 years ago in 2021 to withhold our support on director elections at shareholder meetings when there is no meaningful progress. So this is part of an escalation method to our overall engagement strategy as well. So I'll stop here so we can discuss more later on.
Thank you. Thanks, Tina. Really interesting to hear your approach and particularly sort of more detail around your engagement and how you're using some of those tools that investors have to escalate engagements and to really signal strongly to the companies what you like or don't like around sort of some of their activities. I'm conscious of time, so if I may try and combine the last sort of 2 questions, partly because actually a lot of you have already answered some of them in a way anyway. So I'll come back to you, Ajeha, from FSS. I think you already talked about some of the, how you're working to promote integration of risks and opportunities, and happy for you to talk more about that if you'd like. But I'm keen to ask about the adoption of the ISSB standards and some of the challenges around doing so in the Korean market.
질문 주신 건 이제 아마 제일 궁금해하실 것 같은데, 이제 그 ISSB 기준을 한국에 어떻게 내재화시키고 어떤 식으로 이제 도입할 것인가에 대한 질문이신 것 같습니다. 가장 많이 이제 어디 가면 제일 많이 물어보시는 질문이시기도 하고요. 그래서 저희도 이제 해외에서는 어떻게 하고 있는가에 대해서도 많이 살펴봤습니다. 이제 뭐 당연히 이제 EU가 가장 재빠르게 선언을 했고, 그 다음에 뭐 이제 한 달 지나자마자 또 이제 영국에서도 했고, 뭐 이래저래 이제 각국에서 적극적으로 이제 여러 위원회를 설립한다거나 아니면 이제 뭐 컨설테이션 페이퍼 같은 거를 낸다거나 초안을 내신다거나 해서 이제 의견을 조회하고 계시고, 그리고 이제 적극적으로 이제 그 각 국가별로 이제 투자 문화나 그동안에 갖고 있었던 규제에 이제 적합한 방법으로 대응을 하고 계신 것으로 파악하고 있습니다. 근데 이제 그게 나오기 전에 사실은 우리나라는 2025년부터 이제 ESG 공시를 의무화하겠다라는 이제 금융위원회 발표가 있었는데, 그래서 이제 시장에서는 당연히 이제 2025년부터 의무화하지 않겠는가라고 이제 기대를 하고 계셨던 것으로 저희는 그렇게 이해를 하고 있는데요. 그런데 이제 아무래도 아까 말씀드렸던 것처럼 이제 그 ISSB 기준에서 공시를 하라고 요구하고 있는 이제 아까 좀 말씀해 주셨던 그 스콥 3 배출량이나 아니면 이제 시나리오 분석을 통한 기후 변화로 인한 영향 이런 것들을 이제 공시하게끔 되어 있는데, 이게 이제 아무래도 이제 뭐 여러 가지가 다 얽혀 있습니다만은 공급망에서 이제 배출되는 여러 가지 공급량들을 특히 중소기업 같은 데서도 완벽하게 파악을 하기 힘든 이제 현실적인 제약이 좀 일단 먼저 있고요. 그 다음에 이제 기후 변화로 인한 어떤 영향을 측정하는 부분을 저희가 이제 파일럿으로 몇 개 기업들과 좀 해봤던 경험이 있는데, 일단 업에 대한 이해가 이제 완벽하게 되어 있는 상태에서, 그리고 체계적으로 아주 작은 유닛에서 이제 나타나는 뭐 배출량이랄까 이런 것들도 완벽하게 관리되어 있어야 하는데, 이게 사실 그 담당자들은 좀 이해할 수 있겠으나 그거를 이제 매니지먼트 레벨에서 완벽하게 이해해서 관리까지 하고 더군다나 공급망까지 다 관리하는 거는 현실적으로 조금 어려운 부분들이 있는 것 같습니다. 이제 EU 같은 경우는 사전적으로 이제 아까 뭐 SFDR 나오기 전에 뭐 CSRD 뭐 이런 것 여러 가지 이제 같은 것들이 이제 사전적으로 좀 많이 되어 있었기 때문에 이미 좀 준비가 되어 있었지만은 이제 우리나라뿐만 아니라 이제 다른 나라 이제 따라가는 국가들 같은 경우는 좀 어려움이 있기 때문에 뭐 실제로 26년, 뭐 27년 이렇게도 이제 많이 분포가 되어 있는 것 같습니다. 그래서 그렇지만 저희는 아까 말씀드렸던 것처럼 이제 수출 위주의 국가고, 그 다음에 이제 그러다 보니까 글로벌 규제에 우리가 이제 아무래도 좀 맞추는 경향이 있고 맞춰야 하기 때문에 여러 가지 이제 또 우리가 이제 또 빨리빨리 아주 잘하는 그런 민족이다 보니까 잘 될 텐데, 현실적인 좀 제약 때문에 어려움이 좀 따르는 부분들이 있고, 그렇기 때문에 이제 뭐 다양한 곳에서 여러 가지 노력들을 하고 계신 것으로 일단 지금 파악을 하고 있습니다. 일단 데이터 이슈가 일단 첫 번째 문제고, 그런데 단 한 가지 조금 이제 뭐 이런 자리를 빌어서 좀 말씀드리고 부탁드리는 것은, 그냥 단순히 원래 25년으로 했는데 왜 갑자기 26년으로 했느냐, 아니면 뭐 이제 이유는 당장 하는데 우리는 왜 늦냐, 이제 이런 말씀을 좀 하실 수가 있는데, 이제 공시라는 것이 크게 보면 이제 자율 공시라고 해서 이제 한국거래소를 통해서 공시하는 것도 있지만, 이제 일반 자본시장에서 일어나는 법정 공시라고 이제 꼭 법에 따라서 공시를 하게 되는 그런 것들이 있습니다. 근데 이제 아마 법정 공시를 좀 아마 이제 염두에 두고 계신데, 이제 법정 공시에 대한 내용이 아주 작은 내용이라도 그게 이제 뭐 거짓이거나 나중에 좀 잘못됐거나 이런 것들이 이제 밝혀지면 그게 이제 기업에 상당히 큰 타격이 갈 수가 있습니다. 그러다 보니까 이제 기업 입장에서도, 그리고 그 제도를 준비하는 당국 입장에서도 이제 많이 준비해야 되고 또 많이 좀 더 신중해야 되고 이런 부분들이 사실은 좀 있습니다. 그래서 그 공시라는 것이 상당히 어렵다. 그리고 이제 그게 내용이 아주 작은 부분이 잘못되었다면 그거에 대한 이제 책임이 상당히 무겁다. 이제 그게 결국에는 자본시장을 더 공정하고 투명하게 만드는 거기 때문에 그런 부분들에 대해서 조금 이해를 해주신 다음에 문제를 다시 한번 생각해 주시면, 너무 이렇게 좀 왜 이렇게 잘 못하는가 아니면 늦어지는가에 대해서 조금 다시 다른 생각을 하실 수도 있지 않을까, 그렇게 생각을 해봅니다. 이상입니다.
Thank you. And certainly I just echo the fact that international investors have asked for global governments to implement mandatory climate disclosure. They need this, so they very much welcome that companies are adopting this, bringing this in. In some cases it's already in Japan, for example. I think we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We have to get started. And I think collaboration between different markets, looking at whether it's SME recommendations and guidelines that Malaysia and Singapore have brought out, quite recently, could be really useful to look at how they might have addressed that in their own markets. And AIGCC produced a greenwashing report earlier this year, and maybe we'll look at translating that into Korean to really help investors navigate what disclosure looks like, what good disclosure looks like, and how to avoid issues like greenwashing, which we've heard today is something that regulators are really looking at. So, Andong-sab, I'll come to you, and if I could ask everyone, if possible, to keep their final remarks brief, if you like. We do have a big panel here today, but it's great to hear from the range of you on the panel. What are some of the challenges you're facing at NPS around you know, the climate integration. We'd be keen to hear on some of those challenges. I don't want to leave on the challenges piece for all of us, but it's important so that we can then work on those challenges collectively.
이 국민연금이 그러니까 국민연금에게 기대하시는 바가 있다는 것을 아주 다양한 곳에서 이렇게 듣게 되는데요. 국민연금의 성격이 국민들을 대상으로 하는 그런 사업이다 보니까 이해관계자의 범위가 매우 넓습니다. 그래서 당연히 가입자인 국민으로부터 그 국민들을 모두 다 이렇게 포섭할 수 없기 때문에 각각의 대표들, 뭐 근로자, 사용자 단체, 근로자 단체, 그다음에 지역 가입자 단체 관련돼서 운영하는 그 저희를 감사하는 국회까지 굉장히 많은 분들이 저희들에게 이제 의견을 주시고 있는데 그 좀 중요한 문제는 그 의견들이 큰 그림에서 길게 놓고 보면 이런 환경 문제라든지 뭐 클라이밋 체인지 같은 것들이 굉장히 중요한 문제임은 이제 깊이 다 공감은 하고 계시는 건 맞습니다. 규제 당국뿐만 아니라. 그런데 이제 이것을 단계적으로 시행하는 그런 방법, 그러니까 짧게는 1년으로부터 뭐 길게는 한 십수년 이상의 그 모습으로 이렇게 나아가는 모습은 사실 그 이해관계자들마다 상당히 좀 다른 그런 경향을 보이고요. 특히 이제 규제 당국도 그렇고 저희 내부에 있는 이제 내부자들, 저희 이제 내부에서 이런 논의들을 하는 사람들도 의견이 좀 분분한 건 사실이긴 합니다. 그래서 이 문제를 하나로 이렇게 딱 특정하기는, 도전 과제를 하나로 특정하기는 좀 쉽지는 않지만 그래도 이제 그간에 논의됐던 것을 좀 살펴보면 여전히 그 문제는 있습니다. 그 장기적으로는 분명히 이게 해야 될 문제이기도 하고 뭐 기금의 수익에 도움이 될 거라는 생각을 하는데 짧게 보면 이 문제를 좀 어떻게 볼 것이냐. 우리가 그렇다고 그 장기로 보는 것이 맞는데 이제 단기도 그러면 안 볼 수는 없는 거 아니냐라는 그런 의견들이 최근에 좀 많이 생기고 있습니다. 특히나 아까 그 모두에도 다른 세션에서 설명이 되었던 것 같은데 이런 에너지 위기라든지 이런 것들이 이제 불거지기 시작하고 특히 또 유럽에서는 아까 말씀하셨지만 다양한 규제들이 나와서 좀 더 강제되는 모습이 있지만 실제 미국에서는 그렇지 않은 모습도 꽤 많이 나오고 있거든요. 근데 우리가 이제 그런 문제들을 좀 종합적으로 고려해 보면 그 결국 그 장기적인 문제와 단기적인 문제, 그 다음에 그걸 통해서 얻을 수 있는 이익의 문제와 그걸 통해서 잃을 수밖에 없는 기회의 문제, 그걸 통해서 생기는 이득, 비용 등등등이 좀 종합적으로 고려돼야 하는데 이제 그런 문제들이 좀 해결하기가 좀 쉽지 않은 그런 당면 과제이고요. 그래서 저희가 또 어떤 부분에서는 이것 때문에 그 아까 협력적 인게이지먼트를 많이 해야 된다 그래서 글로벌하고 계속 논의하고 함께하면 어떠냐 이런 논의도 있지만 또 그 반대쪽에서는 그들은 그들만의 입장이 있는 것이다. 그들은 과거에 이미 다 충분히 에밋하고 나서 이제 경쟁력을 확보했으니 그들은 이제 줄여도 되는 문제인데 대한민국은 아직 그런 지위나 역할에 있지 못하지 않느냐. 그러니 더 누리고 해야 한다라는, 그러니까 이것도 상당히 좀 상충된 또는 뭐 서로 사뭇 다른 그 의견들이 있는 게 현실입니다. 그래서 이게 뭐 지금 시점에서 이런 문제들을 어떻게 극복할 수 있느냐 이렇게 물으시면 사실 답변이 좀 어렵긴 합니다. 다만 그 여기 이런 자리를 통해서 저희가 뭐 규제 당국으로부터 뭐 SM 매니저들, 그다음에 같은 오너들, 그다음에 여러 그 교수님들, 그다음에 연구자분들과 한꺼번에 같이 논의해서 이런 문제를 조금 해결해 볼 수 있도록 이렇게 좀 하고자 합니다. 많이 좀 지원 및 성원 이렇게 해주시면 좋겠습니다. 이상입니다.
Thank you. Not an easy question to answer, so really appreciate you laying out some of those challenges. So just in brief final comments, Sung-hyung, what are some of the, where do you see the most opportunities from the transition and what would be helpful in supporting your portfolios?
저희는 그 증권사로서
Maybe just, I think you just need to turn the mic on. Thank you, that's great.
저희는 증권사로서 말씀드렸듯이 그 해외에서 온실가스 감축 사업을 주로 하고 있는데요. 그 최근 한 3, 4년간 그 글로벌 상세 배출권 시장을 주도해 온 것은 그 해외 글로벌 대기업들이 주로 투자를 하면서 시장을 주도해 왔습니다. 반면에 그 올해 들어서는 이런 탄소 시장에서 무결성 이슈가 좀 많이 부각이 되면서 시장 자체가 크게 축소되고 있고, 또 그런 점이 저희 같은 상세 사업을 하는 오르거나이저 입장에서는 큰 부담으로 작용을 하고 있고요. 이런 부분은 앞으로 방법론이나 모니터링 관련된 부분들이 좀 완결성을 찾아가면서 많이 좋아지리라고 생각을 하고 있고, 또 반면에 저희 입장에서 기회로 여겨지는 부분은 이제 6.2조 시장이 또 등장을 하면서 또 올해 들어서 그리고 내년에 많은 정부 부처들의 예산이 또 타당성 조사 지원 사업에 배정이 되어 있어서 이런 부분은 저희 온실가스 감축 사업자 입장에서는 큰 기회 요인이 된다고 생각을 합니다. 이상입니다.
Great, thank you. And just Seiji, coming back to you, what elements would you see that you think need to be addressed in the Korean market to help accelerate further investment from your perspective as an international investor?
Yes, just some kind of brief sort of thoughts based upon background in Japan. And even in Japan, I think this is likely similar to South Korean cases, but Japan is has a very strong industrial community, obviously, so industrial community has much more power to say, and they don't want to have any interventions from financial industry in the first place. So anytime when we make an engagement with the companies, it becomes very contentious in some cases. So I think in order to sort of avoid that, I think the best way is to have a kind of a platform or the framework supported by policymakers to sort of encourage to adopt, say, frameworks such as TCFD. And in Japan there is a forum called TCFD Consortium, which is led by the private sector and private sector and public sector, which would sort of encourage both sectors to sort of engage or have a dialogue in a very regular basis. And we are also part of that. And there are about 200 companies have joined this consortium, and financial industry, both overseas and domestic investors, about 120 companies joined this forum and have a regular dialogue between these private sector issuers and the investment management community. So there are these subtle sort of framework of communication would be very important, and to having those kind of a framework much more better to raise this level of standard and understanding and having a sort of capacity building. I think those are the areas that maybe South Korean market may work in order to support these small companies or the strong industrial base to adapt to more commitment to climate change.
Thanks, Seiji. And Tina, from you, what would you like to see happen in the Korean market to really accelerate investments in this market from your perspective?
First of all, I'd echo Seiji's point, more collaboration, having more collaborative platforms. I also see something similar in the Taiwan market where the companies actually gather together on net zero initiatives as well, apart from the global initiatives. And I think it's a really great platform from idea generation, idea swapping, etc. Another way of collaboration we are starting to ask for more in our engagements with companies is actually asking more of the leaderships of the companies to bring along their supply chain. So exactly what Mr. Yi was mentioning, it's actually quite hard for SMEs to be able to learn all of these things that have been developed in the past few years. There's an abundance of knowledge that you need to complete all these kind of disclosures. And what we see in the market in terms of disclosure is that the big companies, the big conglomerates, they're actually really, really good on this. And so we're increasingly asking for more kind of leadership on this front. And that's why Scope 3 is important, because then you can demonstrate how you're helping your suppliers to transition along with you. And then I guess apart from the depth, which I also agree with the previous panel's discussion, that we've gotten past the point for large corporations on target setting, on basic disclosures. We're at the point of really looking at how business strategy is aligned. And one way we look at that, the discussion is much more deeper now. It's about capex planning for mid to long term, et cetera. So, and then I just wanted to also mention, apart from depth, from engagement front, we're also increasing the breadth of our engagement. So climate is really only a part of the wider sustainability topic. And so whether it's nature or ESG. So, this morning we heard a lot about EV, about energy, about the energy transition, and Professor in a previous panel mentioned that this all needs a lot more minerals, for example. And the mining sector is critical to the net zero transition, but it is also very highly exposed to other environmental and social risks. So this is something that we also engage a lot on with these new energy sectors, because there's a concept called do no significant harm in Europe, where in order to be considered as a sustainable investment, apart from your business or your product or service being aligned with a sustainable future, how you're producing that product also has to be ensured that it's not doing any significant harm to other aspects of your environment or your society. So this is the breadth I'm talking about to I guess, on management of the supply chain, et cetera. And just lastly, on disclosure front, I completely understand the difficulties for disclosure. There is a number of things that companies need to disclose on. There's actually a number of things asset managers have to disclose on as well. So fully echo with the pain and the investment that has to go in. At the same time, through my personal engagements with companies, oftentimes we realize it's not that the companies aren't doing things, it's just they're not disclosing it. And that's really unfair to the companies, because when they don't disclose it, we can't really assume they're doing it, and then that puts them at a disadvantage when investors are conducting their investments, because then they're susceptible to probably not really robust third-party rating methodologies, which would lead to investors not being able to invest in them. So I think there is a balance between finding the right amount of disclosure and also kind of balancing out that cost as well. So, and there, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I will just come to you, Ali, just for some very quick, we're over time, unfortunately, but I just wanted to, if you had any final thoughts that you wanted to share after sort of some of the things that you've heard here today. I know you didn't get to cover all of your presentation before, but is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
Thank you very much. I'll keep it very brief. I would like to echo the comments that you started with. So as you mentioned, we're running out of time. And the challenge that we face, particularly in Korea, and I see Professor Kim Sang-hyuk sitting there, over the last decade or so, we have heard a lot of discussions around how Korea can decarbonize. But if you look at actually the progress on decarbonization in Korea, it's been relatively slow compared to the rest of its peers among OECD. Now, this is not to say that Korean companies or Korean citizens don't want to do it. They do want to do it. But fundamentally, we need to recognize that if you have an energy market structure which is dependent on a couple of companies which are then dependent on political intervention, it becomes really difficult. The reason I put up that chart earlier, and actually MPS is one of the largest shareholders in KEPCO, is that if you have one company that's accounting for a quarter of your emissions, if that company is not on a decarbonization trajectory, then the country cannot decarbonize. Like, I'm very sorry, the math just doesn't work, particularly when we're talking about electricity, which then all the other companies that we're talking about for their scope 2 and 3 emissions are relying on. So this is something that fundamentally Korea will have to reconsider. Europe had the same problem, so particularly Southern European countries. If you look at Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, they all had vertically integrated state-owned companies, NL, EDP, EDF. The EU Third Energy Package actually required that structure to be completely transformed. Now NL has not only been able to successfully decarbonize, it's one of the most valued utilities globally. Investors have rewarded NL by investing. I would encourage everyone, and unfortunately we don't have time, go and look up in Naver or Google, whatever search engine you like, Enel's stock price change over the last 2 decades and compare that with Korea Electric.
Thank you. A great example to finish on, and it's conversations like that that investors are prepared to dig in and work out these challenges, and that's what we wanted to just highlight across the spectrum today, from investors, the regulators, some of the challenges we're seeing in the Korean market, but the incredible opportunities that we've heard so much about today, and that capital is willing to bring that into the Korean market, which it does need. And so with that, we do have a policy roundtable this afternoon to have conversations like that. We have another event tomorrow we're co-hosting with the Korean Chamber of Commerce and a number of industry associations. Investors will be talking with POSCO on their experience around how engaging productively with companies is working really well so that they can engage on the challenges of the transition, particularly in hard-to-abate industries. So these are a couple of other events that we have here across the few days. I hope this session was interesting. I know we've gone over time, I apologise, but please please join me in thanking the panellists today for their fantastic contributions. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
네, 발표에 수고해 주신 연사분들께 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.